When we are stuck in our endless democratic cycle, electing leaders, waiting for promises to turn into policy, watching the inevitable failures and starting the process all over again, it's easy to feel like we're trapped in a never-ending loop. But here's the thing, democracy hasn't always looked like this. Across centuries and cultures, societies experimented with governance in surprising ways. And some incorporated democratic principles that are almost unrecognizable to us today. In this video, I'll explore examples of these fascinating systems through three categories, from the direct democracy of ancient Greece and indigenous societies, to the Mediterranean Sortition-based republics of the late Middle Ages and Renaissance, and even the unique republics of Rome and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And each of these systems remind us of an important truth. Our current version of democracy, representative electoral-based democracy, isn't the final or only form, just one way among many. Democracy has taken many forms, each with its own strengths and flaws. And when we confront the frustrations and limits of today's systems, these stories can inspire us to imagine alternatives, one that might better serve the needs of our time. This video is the first in a series of 3 videos uncovering the history of democracy. Together, we'll look at these innovative systems from the past, and then we go look at the French and American revolutions, where these early systems were set aside, paving the way for the election-based democracy we know so well today. When we think of democracy, ancient Greece often comes to mind. In the city-state of Athens, one of the most interesting democratic experiments emerged, which greatly influenced the West. Ancient Athens practiced something that we normally call direct democracy, where, as we know from this video, citizens participated directly in decision-making without relying on elected officials. But, as we will uncover, calling it direct isn't the full story. Athens had a democracy that rested on 3 main principles that differ greatly from our modern representative systems. First, the participation of citizens was direct, in contrast to our current systems where we rely on representatives. Nowadays, we mainly know this from American jury duty, but in Athens, citizens participated daily in almost every decision. Second, decisions were made by very large crowds in the ecclesia, the People's Assembly, where thousands of citizens came together and debated. The People's Court, Eulalia, had around 6,000 members, and some juries consist of hundreds of people, making democracy a collective act on a grand scale. And third, most government roles were not assigned by elections, but by drawing lots to minimize corruption. Because they also reassigned posts every year, citizens were made to switch places as often as possible to achieve maximum participation and prevented individuals from amassing too much power. But not everyone was drawn, as military and financial leadership positions were filled by elections for the sake of competence, but most other roles rotated frequently. In ancient Greece, the most important governments were indeed manned by citizens through sortition. The first was the ecclesia, or the Citizens' Assembly, the sovereign governing body of Athens. Almost every one of 40,000 adult male citizens were welcome to attend the meetings of the ecclesia. And at the meetings of the ecclesia, decisions were made about war and foreign policy, laws were approved and written, and public officials were approved of or condemned. And another central governmental body was the Council of 500, which prepared the agenda for the People's Assembly and oversaw most government functions. Here, citizens were also the center of power, as 500 members were drawn by lot. The third most important institution was the popular court. Every morning, the People's Court would choose hundreds of jury members by lot out of a pool of 6,000 citizens. The jury had almost unlimited power, which made it very democratic. To the Athenians, the idea of a career politician would have been unthinkable. Aristotle, a key philosopher of the time, put it bluntly. For him, the essence of democracy was liberty, and liberty meant that all citizens should both rule and be ruled in turn. The lottery system was more democratic. Pure chance could not be influenced by money or popularity and stopped corruption. This principle was central in the life in ancient Athens. Nearly half of all citizens over 30 served on the Council of 500 at some point in their lives. Judges were chosen for a single day, and councillors or magistrates served for just 1 year. And people would switch mandates constantly, as anyone who was capable of government posts could put themselves forward, leading to broad participation. However, here it is important to note that despite its direct participation, Athenian democracy wasn't purely direct. Institutions like the Council 500 acted as between citizens and public decision making, but unlike today's elected representatives, they were chosen by lot, a process some scholars call non-electoral representative democracy. The distinction between ruling and being ruled is not election, but sortition. Here, it is important to note that like many of the systems we will discuss here, the Athenian democracy wasn't perfect. It fell spectacularly to a populist politician and warmongering neighbors. It was also exclusive to women, slaves and foreigners. But its innovations, direct participation, random selection and frequent rotation of power challenge us to rethink what democracy can mean. And there are many societies who have shown that they do direct democracy even better than ancient Athens. Inspired by the book The Dawn of Everything, I'll show ancient civilizations who truly challenge our contemporary idea that we need centralized hierarchies of ruling elites. Graeber and Rengrau argue that many early societies succeeded with decentralized participatory and power-sharing systems. One example is the indigenous urban democracy of Tlaxcala, which existed around 700 years ago in Mexico. They developed a city without kings, rulers or wealthy elites, and by the time the Spanish arrived in 1519, they described Tlaxcala as a city governed by councils and community participation. And archaeological findings revealed that the city spanned several hilltops, housing 35,000 people across roughly 5 square kilometers. Public spaces included large plazas surrounded by modest homes, nothing like the palaces of nearby Aztec rulers. At its center there was a council meeting place where up to 4,000 people could gather to address important issues. And council positions required public approval, with ceremonies reminding officials of their responsibility to their community. While women had limited political power due to a combination of governments and military service, Tlaxcala political participation came close to ancient Greece in its scope. And Graeber and Rengrau also highlight Mesopotamian urban councils in cities like Babylon, Ur, and Nippur. These cities practiced forms of decentralized governance, with citizens participating in assemblies even under monarchical rule. Graeber and Rengrau remind us that Asian societies had many surprising governance systems, but they had even a more surprising claim in their book. In 1600 and 1700 America, nations of the neighboring Wendat and Haudenosaunee people in northeastern North America had formed political alliances known as confederacies. These alliances governed tens of thousands of people without centralized elections. Instead, clans formed the foundation of governance, with men and women holding separate councils for civil, military and foreign affairs. And senior clan women often advised on key decisions, and clan held seats on larger confederacy councils. Graeber and Rengrau argued that the Wendat philosopher and statesman Kondiaronk influenced Enlightenment thinkers in Europe. A book out of 1703, based on conversations with Kondiaronk, critiqued European authoritarianism and presented indigenous governance as a decentralized, egalitarian alternative. Kondiaronk contended that while Europeans had more material wealth, indigenous societies were richer in equality and freedom, sharing resources and ensuring no one was left in poverty. However, the extent of Kondiaronk influence remains debated. It's unclear whether the book faithfully represented his ideas or altered them to fit the European trope. But these indigenous or Asian societies show us that a different way of organizing is possible, where they focus on direct participation instead of other values. In ancient Greece, use of sortition and public participation inspired governance experiences in later societies, particularly in the Venetian Republic, Florence and other Mediterranean city-states. These systems adopted democratic principles to address conflicts between powerful interest groups while ensuring fairness and competence in governance. The Venetian Republic is a good example, which was in no way a democracy. It was an oligarchy run by several rich families, thus having the government in the hands of a few hundred to thousand nobles. But they did something very interesting. To prevent fighting between the families, a system was used with a combination of sortition and election to appoint the head of state, the Doge. And the procedure, how they did this, was completely insane. It started with the Grand Council comprising of 500 nobles who placed their names in an urn. A young boy randomly drew 30 electors. These 30 were reduced by lottery to 9, who then nominated 40 candidates. The 40 were again reduced by lottery to 12, who nominated 25 candidates. This pattern of lottery and nomination continued until a final electoral college of 41 was selected. And between them, they chose the final candidate, the new head of state, if 25 or 41 approved. And this system was complex and almost a bit overdone, but also smart and innovative. Computer scientists have shown that this election protocol did ensure that popular candidates won, while also giving minorities a chance and minimizing corrupt voting. The system actually worked. The selection of the Dutch went on for more than 5 centuries. And beyond the Dutch selection, the Venetian Republic was celebrated for its effective governance. Citizens fostered a strong sense of communal belonging, referred to as the Commune Venetia, which inspired institutional systems that addressed public concerns and held office accountable. Florence faced similar challenges of factional conflict but took the use of sortition even further. Nearly all administrative and governmental positions, including the head of state, legislative councils, and commissioners, were filled by lot. The selection process occurred in 4 stages: nomination by a family member or guild, election by a commission which voted on the candidates, elimination of individuals with prior positions or criminal backgrounds, and final selection by lottery, conducted in secret to protect nominees from knowing whether they lost by vote or by chance. This system ensured broad participation while maintaining fairness. Despite its reliance on randomness, it achieved remarkable stability. So these republics show us that democratic systems can be as innovative as we want them to be. And then in this section, we'll look at the republics which definitely weren't democracies, but did have some interesting aspects of governing, with attempts of shared power and electoral systems, combined with a crazy history which should inspire today's democracies. The Roman Republic still remains to this day a foundational model for governance, influencing societies worldwide. Alexander Hamilton, one of the US founding fathers, famously praised Rome as having attained to the utmost height of human greatness. Many of his contemporaries were inspired by the historian Polybius, who describes Rome's system as a balance of power among elites, the masses, and representatives of various social classes. However, the reality of Rome's democracy often fell short of this ideal. Central to Roman governments was the Senate, which wielded significant control over political, military, and economic matters. The Senate issued decrees to magistrates and dominated decision-making. Despite its power, the Senate was not a democratic body. It was an exclusive assembly of wealthy aristocrats, and its decision largely reflected elite interests. However, the democratic heart of the Republic was in its citizens' assemblies, which included the Centuriate Assembly, which composed of 193 military units, where membership was determined by wealth. The wealthiest 10% controlled 88 of the seats, while the remaining populace shared the other 105. And this assembly voted on war, peace, and the election of key magistrates such as consuls and censors. You also had the Comitia Tributa, which organized territorially into 35 tribes, and this assembly voted on proposals by consuls or praetors. Its structure, though less biased than the Centuria Assembly, still favored wealthy landowners who could afford to travel to Rome. These councils were combined with the plebeian council, which was a popular court where judging happened. And in these courts and forums was where most of the political life happened in the Roman Republic, with open and mass politics. Voting was a major occupation of the Roman citizen, and Rome was never free from these politics. But despite these democratic elements, Rome was far from a true democracy. The assemblies often faced manipulation. Wealthy elites frequently swayed the urban plebs with bribes during elections. Assemblies like the Centuriate Assembly were designed to favor the wealthy minority, diluting the power of the masses. Travel constraints prevented many rural citizens from participating in assemblies, further entrenching aristocratic dominance. And while the assemblies could propose legislation, the Senate often ignored or overrode these decisions, and most consuls sought Senate approval, ensuring its dominance in governance. As Cicero observed, the Senate was obligated to respect the freedoms of the common people, but their role was largely passive. And this imbalance persisted, with aristocrats leveraging democratic processes to consolidate power. The Roman Republic illustrates the complex interplay between democracy and aristocracy. Aristocrats depended on democratic mechanisms to legitimize their power, while democratic institutions relied on aristocratic promises for stability. However, this balance was fragile. During the late Republic, power struggle among elites eroded democratic elements, leading to the Republic's collapse. This dynamic offers a cautionary tale for modern democracies. Just as Rome's aristocracy undermines its democratic institutions, today's democracies risk similar erosion if wealth and influence shape political outcomes. Balancing the interests of elites with genuine democratic participation remains a challenge, as it did in Rome centuries ago. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth is a unique and fascinating example of early modern governance, blending decentralization, noble equality and innovative political structures. At its height, the Commonwealth spanned a vast territory across Central and Eastern Europe, extending from Poland and Lithuania to parts of Belarus and Ukraine, even reaching the Black Sea. While dominated by the nobility, it introduced principles that were ahead of its time, and later inspired other democratic experiments, such as those from the Founding Fathers in the US. The Commonwealth's governance was founded on the principle of golden liberty, which emphasized noble equality and heavily restricted royal power. Its elective monarchy was a standout feature. After they got rid of their king in the end of the 14th century, kings were chosen to elaborate elections held by the Commonwealth's parliament. During these elections, over 10,000 nobles would gather to vote on royal candidates. These sessions could last for days and were often chaotic, with often dramatic surprises. And through the Golden Liberty, the elected kings were heavily limited in their power, and nobles were granted a wide range of autonomy and privileges. One of these laws was that every noble was equal no matter their wealth. Attempts by kings to favor certain nobles or strip poorer landless nobles of their voting rights were frowned upon. The Commonwealth Parliament was another remarkable institution, and it consisted of two chambers. The Senate, composed of aristocrats often aligning with the king, but also a lower chamber, more democratic in character, consisting of elected provincial officials and the wealthiest nobles. Both chambers voted on issues separately, but ultimately came together for a final vote, where unanimity was required. This veto, intended to foster unity and prevent factionalism, allowed any single noble to block legislation. While noble in theory, it frequently led to legislative paralysis. Between 1563 and 1763, roughly one-third of the parliament sessions failed to pass a single law. In response to gridlock or royal overreach, confederations emerged as temporary councils. These bodies bypassed both the parliament and the king, creating a decentralized and pluralistic governance system. Confederations operated with majority rule, electing their own leaders and military commanders. Some, like the rebel confederations, openly opposed the king authorities, and in turn, monarchs often formed counter-confederations, adding a dynamic element to governance that was rare in Europe. This political system was unheard of in its time. In an era dominated by centralized monarchies such as France, Muscovy, Spain and Austria-Hungary, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth stood out as an extraordinary experiment in governance. It blended elements of a federation with decentralization through autonomy of its regions, an oligarchy where only the nobility had political rights, democracy, since the nobility were equal in their rights and privileges, and the parliament could veto the king on almost everything. Also, 15% of the Commonwealth population who enjoyed these political rights was a substantially larger percentage than in majority European countries, even in the 19th century. It was also an elective monarchy, as the king was elected, and it was a constitutional monarchy, since the monarch was bounded by the pacts and other laws, and the nobility did have the right to rebel and protest. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth serves as a fascinating case study in decentralization and pluralism. It provided a striking balance between monarchy, parliament and noble society that was unmatched in its time. With its emphasis on noble equality and innovative governance structures, it set itself apart from a highly centralized monarchies that dominated Europe. However, the Commonwealth system also had significant weaknesses, particularly its tendency towards legislative gridlock and internal fragmentation. These challenges eventually contributed to its decline and partition by neighboring powers. And of course, it was also unequal to women and minorities. But nonetheless, its unique political system remains an inspiration for modern experiments in pluralism and decentralized governance. And these historical examples explored in this video illustrate that the modern representative democracy we are familiar with today is not the sole method of governance. These past systems, while not perfect or entirely democratic by contemporary standards, present alternatives of power sharing, representation, and public participation. And if you're interested by this kind of stuff, I would advise for you to go out and look more into this. This is a very condoned version of our history, but these systems reveal creative approaches to do things differently, from sortition-based governance to better engaging citizens. And more importantly, these models play a foundational role in shaping the ideas that later influenced the democratic revolutions in France and America. The thinkers and leaders of those movements studied these precedents, drawing lessons and warnings from their successes and failures. In the next video, we will explore the transformative power of the French and American revolutions. We will try to understand how they understood democracy and why they chose the representative systems we know today over other historical alternatives.